Okay, so again, this is the text that we're studying. So as we recite this, bring to mind the meaning of these words as best as you can. We haven't gotten into the actual text yet, but nonetheless, we all have some experience with these teachings on emptiness. So try to make that part of your recitation. I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on Massive Vulture's mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then, through the power of the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. Shariputra, therefore, in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element, and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly, completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared: Tayata Om Gate Gate Paragate Parasamgate Bodhi Swaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage, it is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvatiputra, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, and those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. We go on to do the mandala offering, making this vast pure offering to all the Buddhas, all the holy beings, the Gurus, so we can receive their blessings and become just like them. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon, I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And then refuge in Bodhichitta, as usual, once in English and then twice in the Tibetan, bringing these thoughts to mind. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyabsu chi Daki chunyen gi pe sonam gi dola penchir sangye drupar shog. Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Bob. Okay, so we'll see how things go with Shanka if he resurfaces at some point, but otherwise we'll do something else. We'll figure out how to manage the time tonight. So we're going to start, as usual, with just a short meditation. Having done our prayers, be able to focus the mind a bit using the breath as an anchor. And then whenever the mind wanders away from the breath, bring the mind back to the breath, that basic instruction. After a few minutes of this focused meditation on the breath, I'll come in and lead you in just a short reflection to refresh our Bodhichitta motivation. So I'll ring the bell to begin the meditation period. So now let's refresh our motivation of bodhicitta by thinking about our incredible good fortune at having met with these teachings, especially the Heart Sutra that we're studying, which reveals perfectly how we can cultivate the wisdom that will completely free us from the bonds of samsara, cyclic existence, and will also facilitate our complete development into the state of Buddhahood. So we can feel great joy at having met with these teachings, and even recognizing that probably at earlier times in our lives, if we'd seen these words of the sutra, we wouldn't even have had any sort of movement in that direction. But through the kindness of our gurus, through the interest that we ourselves have taken in the Dharma, we can now come together and read these words together and have a faith and a conviction that this is the way out. This is the way to free ourselves from all of our suffering, as well as to help others to do the same. And just really feel very joyful that you're here with that interest in the Dharma. And then we recognize that in order for us to accomplish that greatest goal, we do need this motivation of bodhicitta. To develop that aspiration to move in that direction is a key part of creating the causes for that. So reflecting on the fact that all beings are suffering in samsara due to this mistake that they make, this ignorance within their own minds, and recognizing that it can be removed through the wisdom of emptiness. Generate that strong wish to help others to do that, to understand emptiness yourself, to be able to realize it in its most powerful way within your own mind, so you then can lead others to doing the same. So have that very vast mind that is embracing the welfare of all beings, so that what we do tonight becomes a cause for that result. Okay, wonderful. Again, thank you all for joining for this second class in this series on the Heart Sutra. So I'd like to just review briefly what I went through last week for those of you who may not have been here or didn't get a chance to watch the video of last week. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but at least catch us up to where we are at. I had essentially 5 topics that I wanted to introduce as part of getting the grounding for the Heart Sutra, the context for our study of this text. I also did talk a little bit about the basic program in last week's class. Know that, again, you can watch the video if you are interested in the basic program and in doing this course for some level of certification, or at least to begin to, kind of move in that direction. So the very first thing was to talk about the teachings of the Buddha and the Lam Rim, and then to go on to talk about the 3 turnings of the Wheel of Dharma, the 4 schools of Buddhist tenets, and then where we left off was with the 4 seals of Buddhism. We didn't quite complete that topic. But in terms of the very first one, the teachings of the Buddha and the Lam Rim, recall that there are kind of 3 levels of the Lam Rim. And if we kind of summarized all of the goals within Buddhist practice, we can say that there are essentially 2. What we call higher status, which is to gain a good rebirth. One is still then within samsara, going from life to life, but nonetheless having more fortunate circumstances in which to abide and to certainly practice the Dharma and so on. It is an important part of our spiritual development to at least move in that direction so that we can create a continuity of good rebirths in order to achieve the other goal, which is definite goodness. Definite goodness includes 2 different states that we can attain. The state of what we always call, in this tradition at least, or generally, liberation. Liberation meaning your own individual freedom from all of what afflicts your own mind, and the development of the state of nirvana, that peace that comes when we are free from all of those, the afflictions and their seeds. And then the other goal that's within definite goodness is enlightenment, where we go beyond that goal of individual liberation to seek full enlightenment for the welfare of others. Again, we just meditated on that, so I don't need to talk so much about that. And it's, of course, to attain either of those goals of liberation or enlightenment, to attain goals of definite goodness, we need to realize emptiness. And so we need to have the correct view of emptiness. And as we're going to see in some of the other sections, it's important that we refine our view of what we mean by emptiness or selflessness so that we get the correct view of it. Otherwise, we will maybe be able to diminish to some degree some afflicted states, but we're not going to be able to remove everything from the root and actually attain liberation or enlightenment for that matter. So the three turnings of the wheel of Dharma are a way of encapsulating what the Buddha taught. Again, they're not intended to be necessarily chronological, but nonetheless, we could say that certainly the first wheel turning did begin with the Buddha's very first teaching, the Dharma Chakra, or wheel turning of the Four Noble Truths, where the Buddha laid out the schema for how he sees the situation that we're in terms of our truth of dukkha, this unsatisfactory state that we experience, and everything entailed in it. That's due to our karma and delusions, which is the truth of the cause of that dukkha. And then the two truths that speak to the reality of what we can attain, that is the opposite of that. The true cessation of dukkha, having all of that, all the causes of that completely over. Attaining nirvana, or again, Buddhahood would even be included in that to some degree, but at the level of the first wheel turning, it was simply taught in terms of attaining nirvana, peace. And then the fourth noble truth, the path, the true path that leads to that, which of course includes the corpus of the Buddha's teachings that help us to practice and move in that direction. The second wheel turning, again, and that wheel turning was primarily intended for those who are holding the Hinayana tenets, and even to some degree Hinayana practitioners, though obviously it's not, exclusive to those, they're not mutually inclusive, those two groups. We can certainly find people, who practice different tenets and different paths, throughout each of these different levels of tenets or what have you. We're going to get to the tenets in the next slide. But the second wheel turning is the Dharma Chakra, where the Buddha introduced this teaching on the emptiness of intrinsic existence. These are what are called the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So again, these sutras are the definitive word of the Buddha in terms of the selflessness, the emptiness that we need to realize. And this is intended for people who have the predisposition towards the Madhyamaka, the middle way school. And so those practitioners who are ready for those sorts of teachings, the Buddha taught these teachings primarily on Vulture's Peak, which is where we're going to see as the setting for the Heart Sutra as well. Then the third wheel turning is where, again, the Buddha made some fine discrimination between what was said in the first wheel turning, where it seemed like the Buddha was only denying certain things in regard to the self of persons, and then in the second wheel turning, where the Buddha was saying everything lacks intrinsic existence. And so in that Dharma Chakra, for disciples who had an orientation towards something kind of between those two, the Buddha delineated what was non-existent, what was existent, and so on. And this actually became the foundation for the Chittamatra, the mind-only school. So we see all four tenet systems, the two lower Hinayana tenet systems primarily being the audience for the first wheel turning, the Madhyamika, the middle way practitioners being the second wheel turning's audience, and then the third wheel turning being directed at those who practice Chittamatra or mind only. So these again are the four schools within their two categories of Hinayana tenets and Mahayana tenets. Vaibhashika and Sautrantika. Vaibhashika is said to be the lowest form of the tenet systems, but nonetheless, Prasangika Madhyamaka actually has some things in common with Vaibhashika when it comes to certain teachings. These are ways, again, of looking back at what the Buddha taught and categorizing the teachings in terms of four main groupings of sutras and teachings that supported particular views. In the Mahayana tenets, we have Chittamatra, mind only, and then the Madhyamaka, the middle way. This is divided into Svatantrika and Prasangika. I am going to talk here and there about Svatantrika. It's an interesting sort of stepping stone to get to Prasangika. But the ones that are highlighted there, again, this is our what we are studying in this exposition of the Heart Sutra, the Prasangika Madhyamaka school, consequence middle way, that is said to be the highest point of view of the Buddha, the most refined view of emptiness or selflessness. Okay, so then to get back to the topic that we left off with, the Four Seals, let's go back into that for just a short introduction and then go on to the new teachings within this that I didn't get a chance to cover last week. The first of these Four Seals, and recall that the Four Seals indicate whether a tenet system or even a person in terms of their own personal philosophy, whether they are in line with Buddhist philosophy. They're the very minimum to be kind of considered Buddhist by what one holds philosophically. Whereas certainly to practice Buddhism doesn't necessarily require that you hold all of these views. You can practice by simply taking refuge in the three jewels and abiding by the laws of karma and what have you. But these are much more in-depth views of things that the Buddha taught. The first one is that all composite things are impermanent, meaning everything that is produced from causes and conditions changes momentarily. It doesn't stay the same. Impermanent and permanent in the Buddhist tradition mean whether things are momentarily changing, which would be impermanent, or whether they are not changing, and that would be those phenomena we call permanent. It doesn't have anything to do with a permanent being eternal. This is not how we define that. We just mean whether that phenomenon through its existence changes moment by moment or doesn't. And all things that are produced from causes and conditions change, according to the Buddha's teachings, change in a subtle way every moment. And of course, many of them also have sort of grosser forms of change that they undergo. All contaminated things and events are unsatisfactory. All schools would say that there's something that is contaminating these things. Generally, it's through the force of our ignorance or our karma, delusions, what have you. Everything that is arising in this contaminated experience of cyclic existence is unsatisfactory, meaning it's dukkha, it is suffering, it is misery. I mean, these are different words that are used to translate dukkha, but unsatisfactory works quite well. It means that these are not things that we should be attached to and wanting to experience. We should actually want to move away from these things that are contaminated by our ignorance, meaning that they arise through the force of our ignorance. Then the third one is that all phenomena are empty and selfless. Sometimes this is just shortened to selfless, but nonetheless, there are two teachings that almost all of the Buddhist schools, other than one little sub-school within the Vaibhashika, would hold are true in regard to this idea of empty and selfless. And we're going to see these terms used in a slightly different way, of course, when we get to the Prasangika Madhyamaka point of view. But let's go ahead and kind of refresh our memory of what we looked at last week in terms of the empty. Recall that I won't read this all again, but Geshe Nawan Dakpa says that really the first two are pretty much generally understood as they are. And I included even the fourth one, that nirvana is peace, is generally not really debated to a large degree. Where the differences are is in the third or the four seals, that all phenomena are empty and selfless. So the first aspect, he says, that all phenomena are empty. This is empty being used again in a slightly different way than what we are going to be exploring as emptiness. But Prasangika Madhyamaka would go on to refine that view and say, yes, and they furthermore are empty of inherent existence. But let's look at the basic way in which all Buddhist schools say that there is some level of what we would call an empty quality to all phenomena. In particular, what this means, as it says on the screen from Geshe Dakpa, is that the self, that which accumulates karma and experiences, in other words, it's the person that it creates that karma, experiences the good and bad results, that person or self is empty of being permanent, once more meaning unchanging, partless, having the connotation of being unitary, lacks any individual parts, and independent, meaning independent of causes and conditions. Well, this is referring, as I mentioned last week, to the Atman, which is in the Vedic traditions, this idea of there being some sort of a soul, something that is a completely independent phenomenon, kind of arising from its, without having any causes and conditions, that is unchanging, that is sort of who you are at your deepest essence. Excuse me. And so, of course, in the Vedic traditions, as I understand them, and I don't have perfect understanding of them, the whole goal is to recognize that this sort of Atman is there and that we want to merge it in some way with Brahma or Vishnu or whoever it is, the particular deity. I think there are different ways that you practice that in different sects. But the idea is that there is something else that is this phenomenon that is the real you, in a sense. It is the self. And of course, this was very easy for the Buddha to contradict, because he says, okay, well, where is this, soul? Where is this Atman? What is the basis for that? In the Buddha's experience of examining the person, there's a body and a mind that are the basis for that person, but there's nothing that is a third component that is kind of the actual person, the real person. So finding something in this way to exist is pretty easy to negate. Nonetheless, we don't have this kind of instinctually. Everybody isn't born innately with this view of a permanent, unitary, or partless, independent self. You have to be taught that according to this view that we're studying, the Prasangika Madhyamaka. They look back on this and they say this is only an acquired belief. And I can speak from my own experiences growing up Catholic, is that I didn't have an idea that there was a soul until I went to my Catholic, catechism school, and I was given this belief in an immortal soul that is this other entity that is a part of my being that goes on to heaven or hell or wherever. But anyway, so this is, again, just this very coarse thing that all the Buddhist schools negate. Without a doubt, every single one will negate that that exists. The Buddha taught anatman, that this atman does not exist. The second one that we didn't get into last week is where we talk about all phenomena being self. Oh, one thing I might mention before we go on is that when we say all phenomena, of course we mean that any phenomenon certainly lacks that idea of having a permanent, partless, independent self. But nonetheless, we can say that from the point of view of this primarily being about persons, about the, as it says there, the self which accumulates karma and experiences the results of that, that those people, they lack that idea of being permanent, partless, and independent, but they also, the objects that they would use, the things in the world that they know and that they partake of and so on, also cannot be used by such a self. They are not objects of use by such a self. That's how the lower schools would talk about what they, this very thin way of talking about some sort of emptiness of phenomena. Mostly what the lower schools teach, what we have to find as sort of the common tenets for all the schools, are the lack of a self of persons. Again, which is what we're talking about here, is that people don't exist in this way of being permanent, partless, and independent. It's the same for this next view where we look at also all phenomena being selfless. For all of the schools other than the Madhyamaka, that is, for the Vaibhashika, Sautrantika, and Chittamatra, what is called subtle selflessness, and we could even include in there the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, because they also do include this, but what is called subtle selflessness is the non-existence of a self that is substantially existent and self-sufficient in relation to the five aggregates. Okay, so what does that mean? That's a mouthful of words, right? Let's look at what Geshe Dogpa says, and then I'll talk about it a little bit more. In relation to the aggregates means that its substance is not other than the five aggregates, whereas the false view is that it is not dependent upon them because it has its own self-sufficiency, its own substance, and its own means of influencing the five aggregates. So the way that Jeffrey Hopkins talks about this view of a self is that the false view, again, of that self is that there's some sort of master or controller that is abiding together with all of this stuff. We even have those thoughts, right, of my mind and my body. Well, who's the possessor of that? Who's in charge? Jeffrey Hopkins uses the analogy of like a head salesperson in a sales department. So you have this sales department that is our aggregates, our mind and body and so on. And we're going to delineate the five aggregates a little later on, but they're essentially a way of saying there's form, our body, and then breaking down mind into four more different little parts. But these aggregates are like the sales department, and you have a head salesman there, kind of somebody in charge. They're not really completely, utterly different than the sales department, but they do hold a different status. And they take charge of the aggregates and think of the aggregates as theirs and what have you. We have kind of this sense of a self. And of course, Lama Tsongkhapa, he doesn't say this is acquired. He says this is actually something we do have innate. And of course, it also can be intellectually formed. But nonetheless, this is something that all of us have. Now, we're not going to go into techniques to negate that self as part of this course, but know that that is a valuable stepping stone to getting to a deeper understanding of emptiness, is to recognize that there's no one here that's kind of in charge. When we think about there being a self who owns the aggregates, and we might even have those thoughts every day, right? Like, thinking about our body or our mind in a very third person kind of way. Well, my body is a mess. My mind is a mess. Like there's some me or something that is in charge of these things that we call our mind and our body. That's a real sense of an independent, self-sufficient self that is there, a person that is there, kind of abiding amongst the aggregates, but in a way quite independent of them, not requiring the aggregates for its own being established. Its establishment doesn't depend upon them in the way that Prasangika Madhyamaka would say. So this is an important stepping stone. And certainly if we've been introduced to things where we've come to adhere to a self that is like the Atman, a soul or what have you, that also, of course, needs to be refuted. These coarser views and this view that all the other schools say is the subtle view that needs to be adopted, that such a self like this doesn't exist. There is no substantially existent self-sufficient self. There's no one kind of here in charge. That does need to be refuted as a stepping stone to get us to realizing emptiness. So this is, again, we're going to see where Prasangika goes a bit further in terms of its logic and its reasoning. The lack of such a self-sufficient, substantially existent self is said, again, to be the subtle selflessness of persons by all the Buddhist tenet systems except for the Prasangika Madhyamaka. So here he's including Svatantrika, Madhyamaka. So every system that I put up on the screen a few slides ago, all of those systems except the one that we are studying will say that in order for you to achieve your own individual liberation, all you need do is refute and come to realize the lack of this self-sufficient, substantially existent self, come to realize that selflessness. One thing I might point out before we go too far is that we are seeing self being used here in two ways, okay? So just look at this terminology that we have here, this kind of self-sufficient, substantially existent self. Well, what is this self that we're seeing as self-sufficient, substantially existent? The self there is just simply being referring to the person, as we saw a few slides ago when we saw Geshe Ngawang Dakpa saying that you have, this self that accumulates karma and experiences the results of that. That's what we're talking about, the person. And of course, some of the other lower schools will find something still that is the person. In Prasangika Madhyamaka, that's what we call the merely imputed self, or when we think about it in relation to ourselves, the mere I. That does exist. The self that we're refuting, sorry to go to these other slides, this selflessness that we're realizing, the lack of this type of a self, that is a fictitious self. So there are going to be times when we use the word self to refer simply to the I that does exist, the person that does exist, or even with relation to phenomena, we can say the identity of that phenomena that does exist to some degree. But the selflessness, when we use this term selflessness, we're negating a superimposed sense of self. In the case of this one, it's a self that has this quality of self-sufficiency and being substantially existent. In relation to what we're going to see for the school that we're studying, it means an inherently existent quality that we could attach to the I, the person, but we also attach it to other phenomena. This will become a little bit clearer as we go through the next few slides. I'm just wanting to make sure people don't get too confused by self being used so frequently, because we have it, in 3 different places there. We self-sufficient, self, and then selflessness. And we don't want to think that they're all the same thing. Again, we're talking about a person, a self that is seen in that light. And that's the type of self that we want to refute, is that additional sort of superimposition. But we don't want to ever refute that the self in a very mere way exists, because that would cause us to fall into a nihilistic point of view. So this is Geshe Ngawang Dakpa points out that there is one exception. I alluded to this a little bit earlier among the Vaibhashika sub-schools. One of them actually asserts that there is a self-sufficient, substantially existent self, even though there is not one that is permanent, partless, and independent. So this is why, as I said, if we really wanted to fine-tune these 4 seals, the 3rd seal would really only be that all phenomena are empty of a permanent, partless, and independent self. We wouldn't go so far as to say that all Buddhist tenet systems agree that there is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self. But nonetheless, these are generally included because it's only this one exception, this one sub-school. And again, how they get away with it. And these systems they're not alive and living, breathing systems these days. This is all in retrospect, looking back at how Buddhism formed and various philosophical systems that developed. So as far as I know, I don't think there's anybody in Buddhist practice who doesn't negate this self-sufficient, substantially existent self. I hope I haven't confused people too much by going into this level of detail, but I think it is important to begin to gain an appreciation for the different ways that the Buddha taught. mean, recall once more that when we talked about the 3 turnings of the wheel of Dharma, we are talking about it from the point of view of needing to determine what is more provisional in the Buddha's teachings, what needs to be interpreted, versus what is more definitive, that we can actually rely on in a much more literal way, because it will actually be something that doesn't require any sort of lens through which to see it, is speaking to the truth. And this is because, of course, the Buddha taught for 45 years, and he taught to people of different predispositions. For some, this was all they could, kind of muster up is, there's no permanent, partless, independent self here. And for others, they could go to the lengths of saying there's no substantially existent self-sufficient self here. And that's, again, most Buddhists, that's an important step in our development, is to recognize that there is no controller over all of this. There is no head salesperson that's in charge of this kind of crazy sales department that we're involved in. And so those beings who needed to go further, of course, began to examine the selflessness of phenomena, began to examine whether phenomena exist in the way that they appear, meaning phenomena other than the person. So this is what we're going to move into in terms of this last little discussion on selflessness, but there's a little bit more to cover in terms of the 4 seals. So among the middle way proponents, the Madhyamikas, it's the Prasangikas who do not accept this as the criteria of the object of refutation of the subtle selflessness of persons. That is to say, they do not agree that the subtle selflessness of persons is a person's lack of being substantially existent, self-sufficient. That's, again, what we just talked about. So all the other schools would say that's what you need to get liberated yourself. That you need more than that, according to Chittamatra and Svatantrika Madhyamaka, to become a Buddha. But nonetheless, for all the schools say that's the realization you need. Prasangika says, no, you haven't gotten there yet. That's a good realization to gain along the way, but it's not the actual realization that will free you from your own suffering, much less, again, bring you to Buddhahood. They say that is the coarse selflessness of person. So this is Prasangika Madhyamaka says that that's coarse. The subtle selflessness of persons is the person's lack of existing by way of its own nature, or what we call, again, inherent existence, intrinsic existence. I don't want to go too deeply into that concept tonight because it's coming up throughout the sutra and throughout our study of this, but it is a much bigger step, to get to that place of recognizing that the person, as well as all phenomena that are not persons, lack existing by way of their own characteristics, from their own side, by way of their own nature, and so on. This is what we're going to be studying as part of this course. And then I just threw this in so you'd have something about the 4th one, because it wasn't mentioned in Geshe Dakpa's commentary in regard to the 4th of the 4 seals. Nirvana is peace, because peace isn't bestowed by Indra, one of these Vedic gods, or anyone else, but is achieved by one's own individual passing beyond the afflictions of desire, hatred, and ignorance. It is a peaceful state that one attains through practicing the path that leads to that. Again, the paths will be different based on the tenet system, but all tenet systems do agree that there is a state that you can attain that is nirvana, that is the complete peace, the pacification of these delusions. And that's not bestowed by anyone else, but rather is through your own practice. All right, moving on. Last topic before we actually get into the commentary and the text. This is kind of a tie-in to what we were just talking about, the types of selflessness. So again, here we mean things lacking their identity in some particular way. So whether it be the person or phenomena other than the person, we're going to see each of those being spelled out. So that's the first slide, is looking at what we often call selflessness of persons. That is taught in all 4 tenet systems. As I was just pointing out with explaining that 3rd seal, all tenet systems say that there is at least no permanent, partless, independent self of persons. That person doesn't exist, and of course neither do objects of use by that person. So we could say they teach some kind of grosser way of looking at selflessness of phenomena, but they really don't examine the nature of phenomena. They only look at the person. And then there are quite a few of those schools, as we saw, other than the one sub-school of Vaibhashika, that also say that the person is not substantially existent, self-sufficient. And again, then you have Prasangika Madhyamaka that we just were introduced to their view. They also will define a very different view of the selflessness of persons, and I'm going to show that in the next slide. And then there's selflessness of phenomena, that is, phenomena other than persons. This is taught only in Mahayana tenet systems in the way of a fully qualified selflessness of persons. Again, or selflessness of phenomena, not this idea that there are no objects of use of a permanent, partless, independent self and so on, but rather that phenomena other than persons don't exist in the way that they appear. There is some illusion going on there, and it requires deeper investigation. And these are taught generally in terms of needing to attain Buddhahood, though in the Prasangika Madhyamaka system, you need this view of selflessness for both persons and phenomena, whether you want to attain liberation or enlightenment. There's no delineation there. So let's go review what we essentially have as categories within selflessness of persons. The non-existence of this permanent, unitary, independent person. And again, recall that all except one school of Vaibhashika assert this to be coarse selflessness. For that school of Vaibhashika, it's subtle selflessness. It's as subtle as it gets because that's the only thing they adhere to. But all the other schools would say it's coarse. Prasangika Madhyamaka would say it's very coarse. The non-existence of a self-sufficient, substantially existent person, again, that kind of controller over the aggregates, that head salesperson, that's generally asserted to be the subtle selflessness of persons, except in Prasangika Madhyamaka, where it is a coarse selflessness. So I think hopefully everybody's following me because we're getting things repeated again, and I liked how we can kind of correlate some of these to what was said earlier tonight, at least, and certainly last week. The third of these, that is the subtlest view, is what we're studying, the non-existence of an inherently existent person, or again, a person existing by way of their own nature, from their own side, intrinsically. All of these terms speak to the same object of negation, the thing that we are negating, that we say doesn't exist in the subtle selflessness of persons that is only propounded in Prasangika Madhyamaka. Again, this is the highest point of view of the Buddha. It's the most refined teachings that he taught about the nature of reality. So this is what he says in regard to persons. And of course, all of these are true, right? There is no permanent, unitary, independent person. It's a good realization to have, especially if we thought there was one. There's no self-sufficient, substantially existent person. And that's, again, something we do have innately. So we do need to negate that. But to get to the goals of liberation and enlightenment, we have to realize the non-existence of an inherently existent person. When it comes to selflessness of phenomena, where we're examining phenomena that are other than the person, such as a computer or a chair or a body or a mind, things that are not the person, we can say that there are a couple of different views that are set out, and these are all the Mahayana tenet systems, starting with the Chittamatra, the mind only. I talked about this a little bit last week, right? The Chittamatra, the mind only school, and this is what was taught in that third wheel turning, in especially the Sutra Unraveling the Thought, the non-existence of object and subject as different entities. Recall that I kind of used this shared this idea that on our minds are imprinted these sorts of what they're called bakchaks, these latencies that are karmic potentials that give rise to experiences of a subjective awareness knowing an object, such as you right now looking at the screen of your computer. So there's the computer and the screen and the light and what have you. That's all the objective side of it. And you have a subjective awareness that is your eye consciousness, and of course your mental consciousness processing all the words and whatever is going on the screen, the things that are on the screen. You have all these different consciousnesses going on, but for every one of those that has an object and a subject, those are arising from the same seed. And according to the way that Chittamatra reads all of those sutras that talk about that, they say that essentially that means that there is no external world. The external world is kind of arising from the same seed that the mental experience of that world is arising from. They compare it to a dream, where within that dream, you have the appearance of an object and you have the mind that is knowing that object appearing, but there's no real object there, right? Because when we wake up from a dream, there's no, whatever we were dreaming about, it isn't in our room. It isn't there, in front of us. So they say that this analogy of things being like a dream is taken a little bit more literally by them, and saying that there is no external world because the external world is arising on the basis of this karmic imprint. So this is one way, again, that the Buddha taught for us, especially beings who have a strong attachment to the external world, or even have strong other delusions in relation to the external world, that they're able to lessen that because they see it's like a dream. It's just a karmic thing arising, just a seed arising, and it doesn't have any greater reality than that. There's no real external world. Well, Prasangika Madhyamaka and either the other Madhyamaka school would go further and say, well, but you're not analyzing consciousness enough. If this imprint is on consciousness giving rise to these two things, you've said there's no external world. But what's going on over here? Now, I'm not saying that the Madhyamaka schools deny external world. They hold to an external world. They say there is an external world. At least most of them. There is one sub-school, is Svatantrika, that says they adhere to Chittamatra tenets to some degree. But in general, and certainly Prasangika Madhyamaka, the system we're studying, they say there is an external world. We can experience the external world. And it arises from its causes and conditions, and there is a karmic occurrence happening here, but it's not the way Chittamatra talks about. So know that the Chittamatra view is a bit of a stepping stone in some regard, but there are some great Buddhist philosophers who said that studying mind only and sort of beginning to adhere to their tenets is a bit like washing yourself in mud before you take a bath. You know, that you're going to negate that view, so why would you hold that view? Because that really isn't a correct view. Whereas all the other things we've talked about, we can hold as correct from that middle way point of view. There is no permanent, partless, unitary, independent self. There is no self-sufficient, substantially existent self, and so on. But for this, it does seem, from everything I've read and from how Lama Tsongkhapa talks about it, that the mind-only school isn't really necessarily quite a good stepping stone, because it is really just intended for those beings who do have a greater adherence to the external world, to help them to have a framework for negating that so that their delusions don't arise as much. But it's not going to get you to the truth. The truth you will arrive at through finding the middle way. So let's go to the screen that deals with this. I'm hoping I get further than what I think I'm going to get tonight, but nonetheless, we'll get as far as we can. The second point of view in regard to phenomena is something you haven't heard before. This is the Svatantrika Madhyamaka, the autonomy school of the middle way. They delineate something that they call truly existent, but it's different than what Prasangika Madhyamaka would call truly existent or inherently existent. What do they say? Let's just take it off screen again, and I'll talk about this from the point of view of that school. What they say is that, yes, this little bowl that I'm holding in my hand that I ring for meditation and what have you, this bowl, it does depend upon the mind being involved with it. It doesn't have complete autonomy in terms of its ability to, stand on its own. But nonetheless, there are some inherent marks within it, that when those inherent marks meet with a consciousness that recognizes it for what it is and labels it and thinks about it, conceives of it, then you have this like 50-50 deal going on here. From 50% in a sense from the object, that is the marks that are on it that indicate what it is, that this is a ringing bowl or singing bowl, that allows us to, make these sounds that to start our meditation or whatever definition you want to give to it. And then there is the consciousness that is knowing that. And actually, this is pretty close to what we are negating in the Prasangika school. We're negating that things have some mark from their side that determine what they are. This is why it's really kind of useful, and I hope you do get a chance to study tenets. I think Venerable George Dreyfus is going to be teaching tenets for Thupten Norbuling sometime in the future, sometime later this year. If you get a chance to study tenets, it's good to examine what the differentiations are between, especially their views of selflessness. And the Svatantrika is going to the place of saying, yes, things do depend upon imputation, a conceptual mind kind of experiencing that. I think they would even include other consciousnesses experiencing that. But there's some mark from the side of the object that indicates what it is. It has some inherent existence, but it's not completely independent of the mind. It's a 50-50 deal. When this appears to the mind and the mind kind of apprehends it for what it is, then things can be established as existent. Prasangika, in their view of what they are refuting as what we call inherent existence, that means that there's nothing from the side of this that indicates what it is. It's 100% from the mind. So it's kind of interesting to me when we talk about mind only, mind only. Well, when we talk about this school, middle way of Prasangika, this is more mind only in my mind, because it's saying essentially that our mind is involved in the creation of the entire world. Our mind is what causes things to exist. This, Tibetan bowl or whatever, this meditation bowl, doesn't exist without my mind knowing it for that. Its identity is 100% dependent upon my mind. Okay, so this is what we're getting at. As I said, I don't want to go too deeply into what we're refuting and what the view of emptiness is, because that's what the sutra is meant to do for us. But just know that this also shows how we have to kind of keep moving further in our analysis and get deeper and deeper into how do things actually exist. But of course, that's the amazing thing about these teachings, is that it's not like, oh, I believe in emptiness and therefore, I'm going to realize it. No, you investigate it, you analyze it, you come to know it, and eventually you can realize that truth at the deepest level for yourself and attain these great states of liberation and enlightenment. And certainly in enlightenment, we can help others to do the same work. So that's what we mean by these three different views. And we see that, again, they're much coarser at the Chittamatra level. It gets subtler with Svatantrika. And then by the time we get to Prasangika, it's pretty darn subtle. This is an object of refutation or negation that's a bit hard for us to find. And that's why this sutra is so valuable, is to help us to get to that. One thing I'm going to share with you before we get into the text, which we are going to do momentarily, is just this wonderful little verse that comes from Aryadeva's 400 stanzas. Aryadeva was said to be kind of the model Madhyamika. He was a student of Nagarjuna's. You heard of Nagarjuna. Again, Nagarjuna is renowned for having explained the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras in his text, The Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way. Fundamental treatise on the middle way, called Wisdom, I think is the full name. It says, those with little merit do not even doubt this teaching. Entertaining just a doubt tears to tatters worldly existence. So don't feel like you have to get it all in this course. If you even begin to develop a doubt about how things exist or about how you exist, which most of us have gone beyond perhaps, but at least to have a doubt, that already starts to rip it all to shreds. That's already starts to pull down everything that we've got, this construct of our worldly existence, samsara. The way out of it is to begin to doubt that things are as they appear. Once we begin that process of doubt, then we start investigating into how do things actually exist, and we begin to develop greater conviction in the fact that things don't exist in the way that they appear. So we're going to go into the text. Again, recall that we have the Heart Sutra that we read. There is a version of it that is posted out on the website at the materials page. That is a translation by Venerable George, which is the same one that we use when we recite before the class. I don't think there are any differences in that. And then there's the commentary. The commentary is also out there. It's called Jewel Light Illuminating the Meaning by this Lama Tendar Larampa. Tendar Larampa is a Mongolian Lama. Lived about 250 years ago, a little bit less than that in terms of his ages where he was actually producing a lot of writings. They say his last known writing was produced in 1839. And he may have lived longer than that. They don't know for sure his date of death, but that's pretty amazing. In that day and age, to live over 80 years, of course, is pretty hardy individual living on the Tibetan plateau or the Mongolian plateau up there, in pretty dire circumstances. So if we look at the book, we see, or the text, and I'm going to put it up on the screen shortly, we see that there are initially a few verses of homage. This is very common for these texts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but I will read them and comment here and there. And then we get into the actual explanation of the meaning of the text. And there's going to be a few pages that deal with the general meaning. And even in that, I'm not going to teach on every page because I want to get into the second part, which is the meaning of the individual parts of the text of the Heart Sutra. And that is the duration of that text of the commentary by Tendar Larampa. But know that even that, there are a couple of passages that I may skip over simply because I think it goes beyond what we need to know for this course. So in terms of the general meaning, well, actually, let's leave this off till I do the verses. Let me do the verses first. Get that up on the screen. It's right here. Oh, one thing I'm going to cover really, really briefly. Know that there's also a supplemental reading list that I would encourage you to take a look at. That's posted out there. If you are taking this for certification, I would highly recommend then that you're actually would be a requirement. I can make it a requirement to read the first book at least, Essence of the Heart Sutra, His Holiness's teachings on that. If you can also read the second one, and neither of those books is that long, it's also really, really good because the second one, Geshe Sonam Rinchen's, actually is working with the same commentary that we have. So I will be quoting from him here and there on the slides, but and then there are two free books that you can obtain. One, teachings from Geshe Tsultam Gyaltsen, who died quite a number of years ago. He used to teach out in Long Beach at Tupten Darjeeling. Um, and then Sun Illuminating the Profound Meaning of the Heart Sutra, which one of our monks, Venerable Fedor Strake, he translated this commentary, and it's got some nice things in it. So know that you've also got those free commentaries that you can refer to. And then there's a fifth book, which is The Key to the Treasury of Shunyata by a Sarah May Lama. He was from the Sarah May branch of the Sarah University, whereas normally most of our lamas are from Sarah J. But he has a really nice commentary on the Heart Sutra in a book that also contains another commentary that's quite interesting. And if you need texts that explain better the middle way view of emptiness, better than I can, Insight into Emptiness is excellent. It was the same book I was recommending last year when we were doing the course on the Sword of Manjushri. And then another book that's quite nice, How to Realize Emptiness by Genlam Rinpa. And then the third one is The Middle Way, some teachings that His Holiness did on Nagarjuna's texts that actually cover a lot of the same type of material. All right, so those are just briefly the reading list. Let's get into the commentary, and we'll go till about 8:15, well, maybe about about 8:15 to 8:20, right in there, and then we'll have a short break. The bee of clear awareness gathers the honey of precepts from the Kadam instructions. Kadam, by the way, is this lineage that is referring to the tradition that was founded by Lama Atisha, who came to Tibet about 1,000 years ago. And this word ka is referring to all the words of the Buddha. Ka is Tibetan for word, and then just take all of those words as personal instructions, which means Dham, instructions. So word instructions is literally the translation of that. The Kadam tradition is where we take it all as sort of practical advice, all the words of the Buddha. So this bee of clear awareness that gathers the honey of precepts from these instructions, contentment comes from the good taste of the doctrine, the Dharma. May I be protected with excellent fortune by the supreme spiritual friend. Of course, the gurus are highlighted in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, so we often see the guru being mentioned towards the beginning of these verses of homage. The glorious one who bears the banner of the subduer's teaching. Our gurus are so important because they are in that lineage of carrying the banner of what the Buddha himself, the subduer, taught and bringing it into our lives. I pay homage with the crown of my head at the lotuses, at the feet of Munindra. Munindra, of course, is the Buddha, the very capable one. Anyway, there's enough to say on that. The gold mountain of his form body is surrounded by the light of the major and minor marks. So the form body of the Buddha that was in this world was called a supreme emanation body, has all the major and minor marks, the 32 major, the 80 minor. And in the ocean of sport of his auspicious speech are reflected the objects of knowledge. The sun of his mind destroys the dark troubles of the world. So he's paying homage, in a sense, to the body, speech, and mind of the Buddha. The body of the form body, the speech, his amazing speech that liberates and so on. And then the mind that is completely omniscient and infused with perfect compassion for all beings to destroy all the dark troubles of the world. Then next homage is to goddess Sarasvati. Sarasvati is said to be the goddess of wisdom, literature, poetry, but here it's primarily in the context of wisdom. Graced with the glory of youth, like a goose playing in a lotus lake, remain happily in the clear pond of my unmuddied mind and bestow upon me supreme courage. So I don't see that many references to Sarasvati, but nonetheless, Tendar Larampa must have had some strong connection to that sort of goddess of wisdom and is making this plea for that being, that force in the world to remain and give him this courage to be able to compose this text, to realize emptiness, what have you. I respectfully revere Nagarjuna and Asanga. Nagarjuna founded the Madhyamika, the middle way school, and Asanga founded the Chittamatra school. These are again the two charioteers that kind of set the track, the initial track for those two sets of tenet systems. Whom the conqueror himself in countless scriptures showered with flowers of explicit praise, saying they are valid persons, unmistaken. So even though some of the teachings they gave, like Asanga, he said he gave them mind-only teachings, but he had a purpose for doing that, just like the Buddha, to lead people skillfully on a path of eventually arriving at the correct view of emptiness. There are many who say that Asanga actually had the correct view of emptiness that Nagarjuna was expounding. It's just that he was the charioteer of the mind-only school, and he did it in part for his brother, Vasubandhu, who was inclined towards the Hinayana. But anyway, that's another story. Although the bee of my mind cannot comprehend the vastness of the sky of topics of the profound perfection of wisdom, this discourse, holding as much as can be taken with the point of a hair, is made to refresh those who seek much hearing. So I certainly, if this is Tendar Larampa saying this, I'm, well beneath that. The bee of my mind can't, even hold a candle to what he's capable of doing. But nonetheless, this is also very common to see in these texts as a verse of humility and a sort of promise to compose, saying that I will do this even though I don't know much. I will set it out so that maybe others can benefit from it. Maybe even I myself can benefit from it. So we get into once more the general meaning and the meaning of the parts. So before I go on to that, let me pull up the screen that has the slide for the general meaning. And I'll give you kind of a rough outline of the main topics in this. It's not divided into these outlines, but essentially the general meaning begins by talking about who is the speaker of this sutra, the Heart Sutra, and what is the nature of his speech. Then secondly, we look at a very brief little paragraph on page 4 that has to do with from whence or from what do the sutras arise? Where do they come from? Where were they taught? When were they taught and recorded? Which is kind of the whole last part that, again, I'm going to skip over good chunks of that because it's maybe not quite as important. So let's go back and forth. I'm toggling back and forth, doing pretty well tonight. I better not say that though, because I'll probably screw it up. Okay, the general meaning. The first topic again being who is the speaker of it, and what is his speech. The speaker of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras is Shakyamuni. Now we just read it before class, right? And you go, wow, Shakyamuni's not speaking a whole lot. At the end, he says, well said, that is just how it is, just how it is, whatever, all those ways of kind of just putting a punctuation mark at the end of the sutra. But we're going to see how we could still include everything else in it as being a sutra by Buddha, by Shakyamuni. There are a variety of assertions among the Buddhist philosophical schools concerning the nature of his speech. This is where I'm going to skip a pretty big chunk because if you want to go into more detail about this, certainly in that book I mentioned, Geshe Sonam Rinpoche's book that is based on the same commentary, he talks about a little bit there. But know that there are a variety of ways that we could talk about the Buddhist speech based on the tenet system. It talks about the Vaibhashikas here, the Sautrantikas, then it goes into the Prasangikas and the Chittamatrans and da-da-da-da. I'm going to skip over this, like I said, and instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to just simply go to a little slide here that gives us an idea of what we could, in a very basic way, say is the Buddha's speech. Whoops, I hit the wrong one again. See, I knew I would screw it up. Let's go there. Okay, so the next slide. Buddha's speech is that which is uttered by an Arya Buddha, its author, for the purpose of removing unfavorable conditions of disciples. And there are 3 divisions of Buddhist speech. And of course, the Prasangika Madhyamaka says essentially it's sound. This is what we mean by Buddhist speech. And other schools might hold different views of that and what that might be. But this is really what we mean. It's the speech that is the sounds that a Buddha causes to be heard by other people. And of course, a Buddha has some pretty magical, miraculous powers around their speech, but nonetheless, this is how we would look at it from the receiving end of what it means to receive the Buddha's speech. It's that which is uttered by an Arya Buddha in some form for the purpose of removing unfavorable conditions of us, the people who are here listening to these teachings. It is important that we look at these 3 divisions, even though this is coming up in the next question that's going to be looked at in the commentary. What do we mean by these three divisions? We can say that there are absolutely the words that are spoken by the Buddha himself, right? And a lot of the sutras have a fair amount of that. The Bhagawan said, blah, 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 and then, Subhuti said, and da, 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 da. You have these conversations going on between the Buddha and other people. You have a lot of passages in the sutras of the Buddha that are in that first category. The second category is words that are spoken with the permission of the Buddha, where the Buddha kind of allows other beings that are there to speak, but it's through the permission and even what we would call the bless, or the, I'm sorry, this is that, let me back up a little. The permission of the Buddha is where we have other things that are in the sutra that the Buddha didn't say right out, but are a part of the context of that sutra. Sorry, I jumped ahead to number 3 here. Permission of the Buddha means that when these discourses finally got written down, such as when we look at the Heart Sutra and it says, "Thus did I hear, at one time the Bhagawan was dwelling on Vulture's Peak and Rajagriha, da 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 da," all the various things that set the context. The Buddha gave permission to a Sangha, who was usually the one who was the scribe for these teachings, to write all of these facts down. So even though these aren't technically the Buddha uttering those words, the Buddha didn't say at one time, did I hear, the Buddha gave the permission to a Sangha and whoever else were scribing these teachings, to include those details in what have come to be known as the sutras. So it's not, again, that these are words uttered by the Buddha, but the permission of the Buddha is behind all of those. And then, I'm sorry, the third one that I began to describe is words that originated from the Buddha's blessing. This is what we see in our Heart Sutra in terms of Avalokiteshvara and Subhuti having this dialogue. Remember that there's that one little intro to that says, then through the power of the Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Avalokiteshvara, and so on. You have this dialogue that goes on that is through the force of the Buddha, through the Buddha's blessing. So just to delineate, whoops, how did I do that? Just to delineate these a little bit more, I've added just a few slides that come from Geshe Sonam Rinpoche's. Now, he talked about them in a slightly different order. So that second one, the words that are permitted, that are through the permission of the Buddha, he says the introduction and conclusion of the Heart Sutra, for example, are referred to as permitted words, which have been included by the compiler of the sutra, again, Ananda or whoever. So this would also be, and the rejoicing that happens at the end of the sutra. This isn't the Buddha speaking or any of the other beings speaking. This is Ananda putting a conclusion to that. Then we have words that originated from the Buddha's blessing, the last one we talked about, and that's the actual exchange between Shariputra and Avalokiteshvara, as I would mention just a few minutes ago. Those he calls blessed words, or words originating from the blessings of the Buddha. In terms of the words spoken by the Buddha himself in our sutra, the part where the enlightened one, the Buddha, expresses his approval, well said, and so on, those are words from the Buddha's own mouth. So in our sutra, we have actually examples of all three of these divisions of speech. So let's go back real quickly to the sutra, or the commentary itself, and go a little bit further. We're into the next topic of these four kind of main topics that are talked about in this beginning part. This is sort of introduction, the general meaning. Next, whence do the perfection of wisdom sutras arise? They arise from the mouth of the Buddha, as well as from the other persons due to the power of the Buddha's blessing. So that already gives us what I just talked about, the context for that. The Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, not just the Heart Sutra, but many of them have other passages where through the blessings of the Buddha, other beings talk. They give some voice to what the Buddha would have said anyway. They're the teachings that completely comply with the Buddha's own intent. So that's, again, where do they come from? The Perfection of Wisdom Sutras do arise from the Buddha himself, as well as others say words through the blessings of the Buddha. Again, we don't include that third category in this part, those things through the permission of the Buddha, such as thus did I hear at one time, and so on. Nonetheless, those we could also say, are part of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, but we're mainly talking about the actual teachings that come in the dialogues that occur, or in the Buddha himself talking to the meaning of emptiness. Now we get into this little passage on where were the Perfection of Sutras taught. Perfection of Wisdom Sutra is taught on Vulture Peak. Why is it called Vulture Peak? And he says it's obvious that there are many ways of explaining this because the following appear in Desisange Gyatso's clearing stains from lapis lazuli. First, you have the possibility that the mountain is shaped like a vulture. Secondly, it is shaped like a pile of vultures. Therefore, it's not just vulture, singular's peak, but vultures, multiple, their peak. Third, it was given that name because vultures protect the mountain where many vultures ate corpses in this kind of, sky burial thing. Fourthly, it is called a pile due to the brilliance of the birds who are beings who understand emptiness. Technically, what this is referring to is they say many bodhisattvas actually appeared on this place, came from other realms and what have you in the form of vultures. Because bodhisattvas who have these high realizations already can appear in whatever form they wish. They don't have any real attachment to that form. So Geshe Sonam Rinchen says that these are exalted bodhisattvas with direct perception of emptiness who came in the form of vultures from other worlds to hear the enlightened one teach. So that could be another meaning as to why these are why it's called vulture peak. Fifthly, when the subduer was 58 years old in the fire snake year, he went to that mountain, which was shaped like a vulture's head. A demon who had magically changed himself into a vulture took the teacher's robe and dropped it on the mountain, where it turned to stone in 4 layers and is known as the Great Vulture Pile. Because that mountain is the place where the Buddhas teach the perfection of wisdom, let me go up a little bit, it, like the Vajra seat in Bodh Gaya, is indestructible. It cannot be destroyed by hardness or fire, and nothing will destroy those places according to Buddhist lore. It's immovable. Therefore, it is explained that although other mountains do not impede beings of the intermediate state, this one does. There are certain structures that, because of their indestructibility, the intermediate state beings, those that are in the bardo between lives, they have the ability to move through substances and get very quickly to wherever they need to go to seek their new rebirth, but they can't get through these mountains that are indestructible in this way. So let me share just really briefly before we go into the next topic, and that may be about all time that we have time for, just a few pictures, of Vulture's Peak. I've never been there. I haven't had that good fortune yet. Hope to get there someday. This is what it actually looks like. I don't know. I don't see the vulture, but or multiple vultures, but this is kind of that little top area where it's more formed and constructed. That's where is supposedly where the Buddha did do these teachings. It's not the same structure, I'm sure, that was there 2,500 years ago, but it's a structure that was put in that place for people to be able to come there and hear teachings or just spend time meditating there. There's what that looks like as you're looking out over, the canyon there where the other mountains are on the other side. These are some Theravadan monks, it appears, the Thai monks or something that are there. Or maybe Chinese monks. They could be Chinese monks. I'm not sure. I don't know those robes in particular. But anyway, they're up in that space doing some sort of homage. The Heart Sutra, again, recall, is not necessarily studied as much by those in the Theravadan tradition, but nonetheless, I think they have, some awareness of it. And the Chan Buddhist and Zen Buddhist and certainly all the Tibetan Buddhist variations, they all do study the Heart Sutras, so they have a strong reverence for this place where it was taught, as well as all the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were taught.
Excuse me, Don.
Oh,
We did not see your picture. We were still, you
oh,
didn't
you were.
share your picture, so you should just
Oh,
that. You were still screen sharing the text.
I see. Sorry. Okay, here's the pictures. Are you seeing them now?
Yes, we see them now.
Okay, there's the picture. Sorry. Thank you for letting me know. I saw something was coming up on the chat, but I didn't go look at it yet. This is what it looks like, again, from up above, kind of looking down, and that little area, that again, that's a bit more defined where there's some structure. That's what's in the next slide. And that's what these monks here are all kind of looking at. Sorry, I missed that. Okay. Maybe that's enough for tonight, and we're about at 8:18. I mean, not tonight in terms of like, that's it, you can go home, but we're not sure what's happened to Shankar. I guess he still isn't here. No?
No, he still isn't here. I don't know what happened to it.
Okay. Well, what I'm going to do then is what I did last week, which is essentially, since we won't be able to do the breakout rooms, because Shankar, unless you feel comfortable trying that, Bob, I don't know.
No, I've never practiced it before. I think it's, I can see the stuff to do it, but I wouldn't want to try it the first time in a live class. So I think we
Okay.
should wait till next week.
All right. So let's just take about a 10-minute break. So it's 8:19. Let's say till 8:30. When we come back, we'll do just a few questions, see if there are any questions so far, and then I'll probably have some time to do a little bit more teaching, which is great because I probably should have gone a little bit further. I start getting pretty wordy in some of my explanations, but I hope that you appreciate sometimes I talk about things a little bit longer than I need to. Maybe for some of you it's annoying, but hopefully for others it helps to clarify things. But we'll see when we come back and if there are any questions. So, all right, so take about 10 minutes and I'll see you in a minute. I'll see you then. Yeah. Any questions on what we talked about so far tonight? Anybody? Anyone have anything? I realize there might be questions, still about, and what I was hoping would happen in the discussion would be people talking about especially this selflessness and emptiness and these different ideas that are there, and kind of seeing if you can clarify those. They're not really one of the quiz questions because I don't think it's kind of the main topic of this course on the Heart Sutra, but nonetheless, I think it is, something that's good to understand. And when you get into the tenets course, you will have that a lot more in terms of the views of selflessness. Stephen says the tenets course starts March 5th. It'll be Fridays, a daytime course actually from 10 in the morning till noon. Hopefully people can make it to those. Okay, and there are no questions. I don't think I explained things that well, but maybe I did. I don't know. But okay, well then let's go back to the text and do a little bit more. Because this whole introductory part, and again, even the topics I was talking about last week and the beginning of tonight, they are important. They're contextual in looking at it. But we want to get into the sutra. We really want to kind of explore these words and what the Buddha is saying and so on, and Avalokiteshvara, all of this. So I think it is important that we do spend more time on that. So again, sorry for not having this screen up earlier with the Vulture's Peak pictures, but and be wonderful to be there someday. Oh, I didn't really want to go back to that necessarily. I wanted to go back to the text. Okay. So as I said, there are 4 topics. We just did the third one that had to do with where were they taught, looking at Vulture's Peak and so on. Now let's go to the next page. This is the top of page 5. This whole section, again, is pages 5 through 9 when we talk about the timing of these sutras. There's a lot of debate out there in Buddhist circles about when different things occurred. When were these perfection of wisdom sutras taught? When did the Buddha teach this, do that, whatever? I mean, there's not a lot of, even though a lot of things are chronicled, there's a lot of confusion about when things occurred. So know that there's no definitive answer to this. As it says there, the scholars of astrology, known as the 3 oceans, who are these 3 lamas, asserted that he taught the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras on the full moon day of the 3rd lunar month and entered Nirvana on the 15th day of the next month. So that places the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras at the very tail end of the Buddha's life, right? If this is what we commemorate when we have Sakadawa, which is coming up in a few months on the 4th lunar moon, the 15th day, the full moon day. That's Sakadawa, when the Buddha not only commemorates his enlightenment and his birth, but it also commemorates his passing into Nirvana, his exiting from this world in a physical form so that he could demonstrate that aspect of impermanence, death, and so on. So this would put the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras on 1 month earlier than that, the full moon day of the 3rd lunar month. So it would be teachings he gave, the whole Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, in that one fell swoop, just before he passed from this world. And then I'm just going to read this next little part about Ananda and what have you, because there are different views of when he taught this, when the Buddha taught this. Jamyang Jepa Dorje refutes the 13th century scholars. Chim, the translator Chag, and others in his analysis of the Perfection of Wisdom. In his system, he asserts that the teacher set forth the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras the year after he achieved Buddhahood. So that would put it at the beginning of the Buddha's teaching career, so it happened either at those 2 points or somewhere in between. So that would be on the 15th day of the fourth lunar month. When the teacher achieved enlightenment on the 15th day of the fourth lunar month, a son was born to Amrotadana, and that was Ananda. At the time when he set forth the perfection of wisdom in the third lunar month, 12 months after he achieved Buddhahood, it had been just slightly more than 10 months since Ananda was born. So how did that happen? To that, Jamyang Shepa responds that there is no fault because Ananda was not in the audience when the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were initially spoken, but he was present when they were spoken later. There are also doubts about this. Again, you're welcome to read the other parts that continue on this page. But let me just clarify. Essentially, if you say that Ananda is the scribe for these teachings, and that's Ananda at the beginning saying, thus at one time did I hear, well, then he's either lying because he wasn't there and he's like hearing it later on from other people who were there who had this perfect retention of what the Buddha said, or somehow he was magically there even though he was just born, at that time, if the Buddha did teach the sutras at that juncture, about 1 year roughly after his enlightenment. So this is where there's lots of debate, and I don't think the debate's worth exploring just to put out that whole idea of Ananda. There is a little passage that follows that talks about kind of how in some of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, actually, let me put that back up there. I may just go a little bit further in what I'm sharing, because I think this is a little bit of an interesting passage in what's called the 8,000 stanzas of the Perfection of Wisdom. There's this introductory part that's indented there. Thus did I hear at one time the transcendent victor was staying at Vulture Peak in Rajagriha with a great assembly of monks, 1,250 monks, which is a number that does recur in many of the Prajnaparamita sutras. They were all arhats who had exhausted the contaminants, meaning they are all beings who have attained nirvana, in control of all minds, and had achieved the excellent perfection with the exception of one person. And this was Venerable Ananda. So Ananda is often singled out as like the last of these beings to become an arhat, that he was hanging out with all these other monks who were arhats, but he himself was not somebody who had liberated himself from cyclic existence yet. So on the basis of that, it goes on into some more debates about it. Again, I don't know that there's great merit in going into all of that. Instead, I want to go forward to the next page and just look at this one paragraph. I think it's like the second full paragraph on that page 6 that's in front of you there. It says, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras are renowned in Tibet by names such as the 17 mothers and sons. These are the 17 Prajnaparamita Sutras that have made it into Tibet in the Tibetan language. They're translated into Tibet. In the early days of Buddhism in Tibet, they brought in these volumes of the Sanskrit sutras, and then they had a whole, translators that were putting them into the Tibetan language. And from what I've heard, the Tibetan language, the written language, was used or formulated in order to do this task, to be able to then, put these teachings down in writing. So there are only 17, and that sounds like a lot, but 17 mothers and sons, these Perfection of Wisdom Sutras that made it into Tibet. Then this next part, the most important ones, however, are 3. What's called the Vast Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, the Intermediate, and the Brief. The vast is the 100,000 stanzas. Satasha Shrika Prajna Paramita. The intermediate is the 25,000 stanzas. Panchavim Sati Sahasrika Prajna Paramita. And the brief is the 8,000 stanzas, the one that we just had the quote from. Astasa Hasrika Prajna Paramita. They kind of give the number of stanzas or kind of individual parts that they are set out in. To the best of my knowledge, of course, the 8,000 stanzas, that's come up in some of our other studies. It is available in a translation by Edward Kanzi, who did a lot of the translations into English of some of these sutras. And I believe he's also done the 25,000. I don't know if the 100,000 has ever been translated into English. But nonetheless, if you go to those sutras, you can see what the actual sutras themselves are like. But these are called the 3 mothers: the vast mother, the intermediate mother, and the brief mother. And these names are given, it says here, from the standpoint of the number of slokas or verses. In general, there are 5 texts. Oh, no, this part I'm going to skip over. Again, this gets into more detail than what I think we need, but that is a kind of an important thing to know, that of the 17 that made it into Tibet, these 3 are perhaps the more important ones because they are the more extensive teachings on the Prajnaparamita, the perfection of wisdom. But the Heart Sutra is included in that corpus. It's one of the 17. Now we go on to the next page, and this page I'm going to cover a bit more of it. I'll skip only a few sections. So we're back with the 3 here, the 3 mothers, the vast, intermediate, and brief perfection of wisdom sutras. And they're called the mothers because this perfection of wisdom is the mother that gives birth to all of the realizations that lead to liberation and enlightenment. They were spoken simultaneously, it said, because all of the requesters are the same. The person who says, Bhagawan, da 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 da, and requests this teaching, it's the same requester for each of those. And the sutras, furthermore, are similar in that there is a prophecy about Sister Ganga Devi at the point of explaining the practice of the Pure Land. So each of those sutras, whether we're talking about, again, 100,000, 25,000, or 8,000, they all have this one passage in there that's the requesters, and then another passage that's about prophesizing Devi's enlightenment. These sutras were necessarily spoken simultaneously because it is not feasible that the same Buddha would repeatedly prophesize the enlightenment of the same person. I guess they do it once, and that's your one shot to hear it and to have that be announced to the world that you will become a Buddha in this particular form in this particular time when that prophecy is made. And so this point was made by the omniscient Bhutan. Bhutan, by the way, is a Tibetan Bhutan Rinchen Drup. It's a great scholar who compiled the Tibetan Kangyur, which is the entire corpus of the Buddhist sutras. He lived from around 1290 to 1364 or so. And he also wrote a very celebrated history of Buddhism, and that's no doubt where that comes from. But essentially, this is an important little bit to know, is that the Prajnaparamita Sutras, these 3, the great mothers, the 3 mothers, were all spoken at the same time. This speaks to the power of a Buddhist speech, is that they can actually speak in ways that different beings in the audience hear it differently. Some heard 100,000 stanzas, some heard 25,000, some 8,000, according to their own dispositions. Then it goes on to talk a little bit more about the time of this, and I am going to read this little part because this also has to do with how did these sutras end up in this world. The time when the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were recorded in books is known as the time of the 3rd compilation of the word of the Buddha. It is not the case, however, that the word did not exist at all in written form prior to that. If it is asked how the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were propagated and in which country, it is necessary to know who owned the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras after the Buddha, the teacher, passed into Nirvana. So there's, again, a lot of these questions, and some of these questions, of course, are raised by those who adhere primarily to the Pali Canon, which would be those Vaibhashikas and Sautrantikas that look at the Sanskrit canon and think, where did this come from? If it didn't appear in this world until much later, is it really reliable as teachings of the Buddha? And the way they explain that is that, as it says here, the 8 groups of gods and so forth gathered together, but because they could not agree through discussion, there was a scramble for these teachings. The Nagas got the vast mother, the 100,000. The gods got the 18,000. The humans got the 25,000 stanzas. The demigods got the 10,000 stanzas, another one that's among the 17. And the king of the Yakshas, Kubera, got the 8,000 stanzas. Again, is this folklore, or what is it? And who are these Nagas? Again, the Nagas themselves are said to be these beings who have sort of a serpent-like form. They're included in the animal realm, but they are much more intelligent than animals. And they were happily there as protectors of these sutras because there was fear that these Perfection of Wisdom sutras would disappear from this world. And then, of course, you have these gods involved from god realms, demigods who also are in a more celestial realm. And then the king of the Yakshas. Yakshas are these sort of powerful gods that do abide in this world in various forms and what have you. And so whether this mythology is true or not, there is this sort of disappearance of these sutras that is explained in this way. And then there's this whole little story that I'm going to skip. I'm going to tell the first little part of it, and then we're going to, again, don't want to get too bogged down in these stories regarding how the vast mother got back to India. The king of the Nagas was ill and nothing could help him. A girl told his fortune, saying that in the land of humans was a master named Nagarjuna, who was skilled in the meaning of the two truths, and who, if invited, would cure the king. In accordance with that prophecy, he went to the land of the Nagas. Nagarjuna went to the land of the Nagas. This is the big mythology that's around the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And this is called the retrieval of the 100,000 stanzas that were there with the Nagas. Often they talk about all of the whole corpus of the Prajnaparamita being retrieved there, but nonetheless, it does seem from this text that it's primarily that 100,000 stanzas. And then it goes on to talk about another version, explains that the master went to the land of the Nagas looking for some sandalwood to erect an image of Tara, and that's how he came in contact with the Prajnaparamita teachings that were there. But this is called the retrieval of the vast mother. And then they take the vast mother, back into this world, Nagarjuna, and he expounds upon the sutra and so on. Whoops, didn't want to go down quite that far. This is kind of an interesting little part that I'll talk about too, regarding how the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras were propagated in the snowy land of Tibet during the time of Trisong Detsen, who's a great Dharma king of Tibet in that early dissemination of the Dharma, who was responsible for so much of the initial taking root of the Dharma in Tibet. Nyangkampa, also known as Langkampa, uh, Gocha, Gocha, Japa, acquired the ability to memorize without forgetting. This is what's often called the skill of retention. That's done through a certain dharani, a certain meditation mantra mode that you can develop this. And it does seem that many people in the Buddha's retinue had this ability to memorize without forgetting. They would hear these things and they would be able to retain them perfectly. He was sent to India to bring back the perfection of wisdom, and he memorized the vast mother, covered his back with a cover of gold, covered his front with a cover of turquoise, just like these pecha, the loose leaf texts that are used in Tibet. And he tied those two covers on his front and back with a string of pearls, like to adorn himself as if he was the sutra, because he memorized the sutra and brought it back into Tibet and returned to Tibet. What he had in mind was dictated in 4 volumes. Um, anyway, this is probably good enough, to give a little bit of the mythology around these Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Let me see if there was anything else I wanted to share. I think this whole next page 8, I'm going to skip over. You're welcome to read these, but they just get into things around the shlokas, the verses, all of this. And I just don't think there's as much, again, relevance to what we're actually trying to get out of our study of the Heart Sutra. So we're going to end up at the meaning of the parts. We're going to actually go through this as kind of a deeper investigation into the text. This is where our actual study of the text starts more formally. Let me see if once more if there are any questions before I go on with this, because we are kind of moving into a whole new section. That introductory part, though, again, it's a bit of mythology, a little bit of information, but maybe again not quite as important. Anyone? Okay, and by the way, you're welcome in any of those other books. They do talk about some of this mythology and kind of where things were and what have you, and you might find it interesting to go through some of those. So we are going into, oh yes, sorry.
I thought there was one question from Fernando. Did you raise your hand?
I didn't see your hand go up. I'm sorry, Fernando. Oh, there. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you very much. It was in relation to what you mentioned previously and in relation to the Chitta Matra school, and something that I have read in the Essence of the Heart Sutra by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, in which he explains that in the Abhidharma it says, I mean, from my understanding, the space is considered to be a permanent phenomenon, right? Or something that it's permanent, the space. And
Space,
then
okay.
there are certain elements that exist there. I don't know how to mention it, but he mentioned something like that. And then because of the minds of sentient beings is that they do conglomerate or something like that, and then a universe end up existing. So then it would mean that something exists before a mind can conceive it, and then it's just because of a mind conceiving it that it takes a form that might be of use to that mind, or is it that way? Then the Chitta Matra wouldn't be of any use for the ones that study the Chitta Matra school, because something do exist before an interaction with a mind.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard about that there are certain elements that exist before a universe created with the mind of sentient beings?
Hmm. You know, I'm looking because I think I put the one book in the other room because I wanted to look at it later tonight. But there's a book that's on your book list by Genlam Rinpa that's called How to Realize Emptiness. He has a passage in there where he talks about this a little bit. And let me reformulate your question for those who are listening who maybe, you know, because there's a bunch of pieces in this, but if we say that again, and the Dalai Lama very much adheres to what scientists say. They say, you know, that there was this world system that developed here. There was this planet before there was viable life on it. And at some point life began, and you have then sentient beings in a world that prior to that, you have the formation of that world without sentient beings necessarily being there. And that's also not just in Western science. I think that's also in the way that Buddhist cosmology is taught, is that you will have worlds arising on the basis of the karma beings, but those beings are not experiencing that world at that time. The world is sort of forming to become a place that will be occupied by those beings. So you might think, again, from the Chittamatrin point of view, well, then how could they hold that? Because if they say that the physical world or whatever is not an external phenomenon, it's arising on the basis of these Bakchaksi's imprints, well, then doesn't it become problematic if you say that there's anything that exists without a mind being there? And the way that the Genlan Rinpa talks about this, because I think we can even run into some problems with Prasangika too, when we say that it's 100% dependent upon the mind, there is sort of the external world. But to say that anything exists requires an imputing consciousness, requires us to kind of designate things as such. That's, you know, the power in Prasangika is resting entirely with the mind in terms of bringing things into existence. It's not saying, though, like Chittamatra is, that there's no external world. It's just saying that the external world, in terms of it having its identity, how is it established? How does it attain what we call its ontological status, is through the force of an imputing consciousness, a designating consciousness. The way that Genlam Rinpa talks about this, which I think would be equally applicable to Chittamatra, is that they're sort of, you can say that there are worlds and places that exist where there is no sentient being experiencing those, but they are, in Prasangika's terms, suitable to be imputed. You know, that there's still nothing that will be kind of established without an imputing consciousness being involved. And Chittamatra, I think, would say that there's nothing that can be established as an object that is known until there is a consciousness involved. So even though they do adhere to this idea of the external world being like a dream and not having any sort of substantial reality, I think Chittamatrans would still say that that world can exist. Like before you go into your room at night, you know, to go to bed, if there are no beings in your room, no spiders or ants or, you know, no cat or dog or whatever, does that mean that, you know, when you aren't in your room, that your room isn't there? You know, they would say instead that it's your experience of going into that room that then becomes this ripening of this seed at that moment. Just like Prasangika would say that then it is your going into the room and saying, oh, you don't necessarily always go into your room and say, oh, there's my bed and there's my dresser and there's this and there's that. But all those things come into your field of experience and you are imputing some identity onto them. Because obviously we're not imputing everything at every time, right? Any experience we have of a multitude of phenomena, those phenomena are still there. Right now, I'm not imputing the books that are above my head. Well, maybe I am by talking about them now. But while I'm talking into the screen, I'm not thinking about those books and imputing them. But they are suitable to be imputed. And that's the only way that those books exist up there above my head on the shelf up here above my computer. So it gets tricky. I don't know if this helps to talk about it in this way, but these tenet systems, again, Chittamatra, as I was pointing out earlier, the point of view that they are propounding in terms of phenomena, according to the Madhyamika, isn't actually how things exist. You know? It isn't actually, you know, the way that we can posit. So realizing it, if you will, isn't a real realization, because it's only realizing something that is a sort of temporary stepping stone to help people. It's not a sort of foundational essence of reality. Because again, Prasangika completely refutes the Chittamatrin view in terms of these phenomena. I don't know, did that help, Fernando?
Yes, it did, but I started thinking about this because I've read before that every single time that something exists, there should be a mind existing. And then when that happened, I used to think about the formless and the form realms instead of just the beings of the desire realm.
Mhm.
And so in that sense, when there's a formless being experiencing something which might be existing in a form of a galaxy or a planet, I don't know if that's possible, because even in the Lamrim Chenmo, it's mentioned that the sun deities exist there and experience certain things, which I don't know if it's manifested as the sun or if in the sun there's a sun deity. And I don't know, I've always thought about this. And then in that sense, that's why I've always think that if something is there to be experienced, it doesn't matter if there's a consciousness or not. I mean, for me, there should be always a mind cognizing that phenomena,
Yeah.
although I don't know anymore. So.
But again, I think it's more that things require to have their existence established, again, to have their ontological status be affirmed. They require an imputing consciousness, a mind that is kind of designating them as such. So we can say that, again, book doesn't exist until there is an imputing consciousness that designates this as book. But what I'm holding in my hand isn't a real book anyway. I mean, it's the basis for a book. And of course, if I go to any one of these pages, that's the basis for a page of the book, and so on. We get into this kind of never-ending sort of thing that spirals down into atomic and subatomic and, you know, all these layers of investigation. But we always find something that does depend upon something else, but doesn't have the ability to set itself up, to identify itself. I think this is more the gist of it. When we say things don't exist except through an imputing consciousness, we mean that this stuff in my hand doesn't exist as book until I designate it as book. Does it mean I don't have any stuff in my hand until I designate it as book? No, it means I don't have a book in my hand, or what we call a book, until I designate it as book. So I think, again, you know, we're not necessarily saying that everything that is out there, you know, that what's in on the third ring of Saturn, you know, that dust on the third ring of Saturn doesn't exist because there's no imputing consciousness there. You know, there's nobody experiencing it directly. Well, you could say the Buddhas experience all things, you know, because they have an omniscient mind, but they aren't designating things. They don't have a conceptual mind. There's no conceptual mind designating the dust in the third ring of Saturn except me right now by thinking about it. But it's not in front of me. It's not something I'm experiencing. But it's suitable to be imputed. And that's the only way that it can be established as being the dust in the third ring of Saturn. You see what I'm saying? It's a fine point, but I think this is what we mean by things being dependent upon imputation, is that we don't say there's no external world that gets imputed as these things. We're saying that that external world, to be established as something, to have its identity being established and affirmed, requires an imputing consciousness. I'll get the passage and read it next time from Genlam Rinpa, but kind of an interesting question. But yeah, I've had the same thoughts. How do things actually exist? I mean, this is the whole thing that we're investigating, but I think it isn't quite the way that you were talking about it, Fernando, in terms of things, you know, we can't say that anything's there until we say something's there through our imputing consciousness. There is something there, but it's the basis for whatever it is that we designate it as. And, you know, different beings have different experiences of different things. If I had a dog that liked to chew on books, well, the dog wouldn't be knowing this as a book that has writing in it that is by the Dalai Lama on the Heart Sutra, and therefore, you know, not chew it or whatever. The dog would simply see it as something to chew on. Has a very different experience of this book if it likes to chew books. Okay. But we see it as a book. We know it as a book. Okay.
See. Excuse me, Don, there's some questions in the chat box.
Yeah, let me go to that real quick. Why is vulture speak described as indestructible? Again, this I guess the allusion to that is that by virtue of what the Buddha taught there, the indestructible quality of emptiness, which emptiness is said to be kind of indestructible in that it never transmutes. It is an unchanging phenomenon, and it has always been there and always will be there. It's established with regard to specific phenomena. You know, emptiness is not kind of this big bucket of thing that, you know, exists as some sort of on its own wide phenomenon. It exists in relation to every particular thing that exists. So the emptiness of me, the emptiness of you, the emptiness of computer, the emptiness of a book, the emptiness of whatever, all those emptinesses, they are indestructible, and that it is a quality of all phenomena that exists that cannot be transmuted in any way. It is actually a permanent phenomenon. It's an unchanging phenomenon. As long as the phenomenon of book exists, the emptiness of book exists on the basis of what I'm holding in my hand that again is merely imputed as book. It lacks any inherent existence as book. Its emptiness is together with its conventional existence. We're going to get into this a little bit later when we talk about that wonderful phrase from this sutra, form is empty, emptiness is form. These two are kind of abiding together all the time. So that's the only rationale that I have for this. It wasn't really explained in any of the commentaries that I recall reading as to why it has that quality, except I would think by virtue of that indestructible truth being taught in that place. And of course, Bodh Gaya was mentioned as another place that's indestructible in that way, because that was the Buddha's realization of emptiness that caused the full transformation of the Buddha's mind into the state of enlightenment. At least this was what was shown there, according to Mahayana. They don't say that the Buddha actually attained enlightenment there. They say that the Buddha manifested that appearance of attaining enlightenment. So I don't know if I can answer better than, maybe other people have heard something on that that could answer that question better than me. But anyone have anything they wanted to add to any answers I've given? I'm not perfect in my answers to things, and sometimes I am guessing like this with this last one, just based on emptiness being involved, which is always referred to as kind of this indestructible quality. Anyone? Okay. All right. Wow, that was a lot of talking. Let's get the prayers up on the screen, Bob, so we can make sure we dedicate all this energy that we've created tonight. As I said, in next week's class, then we will get into the sutra in more detail. We'll actually go into the that part of the commentary and the sutra and explain the words of the sutra, get a better appreciation for what is being discussed by these two beings, Shariputra and mostly Avalokiteshvara. So we dedicate with these prayers. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. And then recalling Bodhichitta, may the supreme jewel Bodhichitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Then we go on to do the prayers for our teachers, these amazing beings who we need in this world. So we make prayers for their good health and long lives, as well as the same for all spiritual guides. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serve as the bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjunath's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplish magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Savior of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. And then lastly, for Osalhita Lama Yeshe's reincarnation, Venerable One, to you whose kindness exceeds that of all the conquerors for those wanderers in far-off places, especially the West, mindful of your loving concern for us in intentionally descending again into a family of a far distant land, we make this request. O Lama, please, please live long. And lastly, dedicate for any beings that you're holding in your heart right now, making strong prayers for them to be free from their suffering, whether they're experiencing obstacles or illness or dying or have died, whatever is going on for them. Think that they are free from that suffering and that they also attain all the causes and conditions that will lead them to finding true peace and happiness. And may all beings be free from suffering and find true happiness through our efforts here tonight. Wonderful. Well, I will, I think the second quiz, I think almost everything was covered on that. So you're welcome to go and take a look at that and answer that if you want to, again, participate at that level. And I will look into Fernando's question a little bit more. I don't know if I completely answered it in regard to Chitta Matra. Chitta Matra is a very funny little school, and a lot of people are really enticed by it, and other people find it to be like, oh my God, I'm not sure I can really get my head around this. I think I fall in the latter category. So I'll try to find what I can about, how they would posit this, but because I mostly shared how Prasangika would posit how things can there can be a basis for something without necessarily the imputing consciousness being there. But I don't know if Chitta Matra would hold quite the same thing, but I'll see if I can find out. All right. Everyone have a good week. Maybe I'll see some of you before next Wednesday, but otherwise, stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you again soon. Be well.